Here.
Director McAllis.
Here.
We have a quorum of 6 present with 1 absent. If the record would also show that Directors Durante, Frega, Fuentes, Hobson, Melvin, Pang, Ross, Totten, and Chairman Dillard are also present.
Thank you. Item number 2 is the approval of the minutes of the June 25th, 2015 meeting. Any questions or comments? Motion by Director DeWitt, second by Director Tarani. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Ayes have it.
7 ayes.
Item 3A, resolution certifying financial results for the second quarter 2015. B?
Good morning, Chairman McAllis, Chairman Dillard, and members of the Finance Committee and other board members. Today we will review the year-to-date financial results through the second quarter of 2015, which are subject to board certification, and we'll also take a quick look at year-over-year performance measures for the RTA system. Director Hobson, you'll see some interesting information about ridership on there. Comprehensive written report of the second quarter results was handed out this morning. While unfavorable ridership has been putting some pressure on operating revenue, the service board's reported financial results have otherwise been satisfactory. At the end of the presentation, I will be recommending that the board certify that the results of operations at each of the service boards and the region taken as a whole are in substantial accordance with the adopted 2015 budget. So a little background, the Chicago region lost 23,000 jobs during the first half of 2015 after a year of solid growth in 2014. However, the size of the labor force decreased by a similar amount, resulting in a regional unemployment rate that held steady about 6.2%. But it still lags the national average by a full percentage point. Our latest reading of the statewide underemployment, or the U6 rate, improved to 11.5%, indicating that more Illinois workers are finding the full-time work that they really want. Regional ridership, which we'll look at now, finished the first half 1.8% under budget, and that is 0.4% lower than prior year. However, when we see the comparisons later in the presentation with our peers, this is actually a relatively good result compared to the other transit systems. Ridership exceeded budget for the first time this year in June, but that was aided by some of the special events like the Stanley Cup Rally and some of the other things. Let's look at CTA ridership. So CTA first half ridership was 1.6 unfavorable to budget and unchanged from 2014, with bus ridership down 0.4%, but rail ridership up 0.4%. Again, it's encouraging that CTA bus ridership is holding steady after decreasing in 2014. Let's look at Metro ridership. So that finished essentially at budget, but it is down 1% from prior year. But remember that Metro had fare increases in February. Pace bus ridership finished the first half of the year, 8% below budget. So that's highlighted in red, and that's down more than 5% from prior year. We'll talk about some of the reasons when we discuss performance measures a little later that Pace has provided us. ADA paratransit ridership was 1% unfavorable to budget for the first half, but it did grow by 3.7% over prior year. So let's look at operating revenue now. That was mixed, with CTA and PACE reporting unfavorable results for the first half, while Metro and ADA paratransit were favorable. Fare revenue was generally in line with ridership, so the operating revenue shortfall is being driven primarily by the uncertainty in the RFR, the reduced fare reimbursement funding from the state. PACE Suburban Service reported a 4.8 unfavorable operating revenue variance, driven again by the lower accrual, so they're not accruing the monthly reduced fare reimbursement fares, and unfavorable advertising and a little bit of investment income. ADA paratransit highlighted favorable results of 5.3, and again, this is more due to the timing differences with Medicaid reimbursements. In the public funding section, we see favorable results. Sales tax receipts continue to show strength at about 1% above budget through April. The implementation of the use tax on Amazon purchases made effective in Illinois February 1st is contributing to the 2015 sales tax performance. We'll continue to monitor, see how much, but it is contributing. Now looking at operating expenses. So for the first half, performance was very good, with each service board reporting favorable to budget results of a combined $22.9 million. Over 40% of the favorable expense performance, or $9.3 million, came from favorable variances in fuel expense, as shown on this slide. Here, a separate little one, yeah, which isolates actual fuel expense relative to budget. Pace who purchases fuel at market prices relatively close in realized impressive first-half fuel savings at prices while they remain low, which is changing. Pace Suburban Service and ADA Paratransit both reported significantly favorable expense results, so these are highlighted in blue, due primarily, again, to the fuel savings, and the latter is due to lower demand and decreased passenger trip costs from the contracted services. But it's also kudos on their renegotiated contracts with ADA Paratransit providers, so they're actually saving significant money there. Let's look at the regional here. Unfavorable operating revenue was more than offset by favorable public funding and operating expense results to produce a net result which was $24.3 million favorable to budget. So that's a $6 million improvement from last month's report. Each service board had a favorable to budget net result for the first half. Pace Suburban Service and ADA Paratransit both have net results highlighted in blue due to the favorable expense performance. So now let's look at recovery ratios. So the year-to-date was 0.3 points unfavorable, but it's still at 50.2%, which exceeds the statutorily requirement of 50%. And again, this is in part due to the RFR, the reduced fare reimbursement. If we're no longer counting in some areas, then it's going to offset that. The revenue recovery ratio naturally climbs, though, as the year progresses and we move out of the higher expense winter months and into the higher ridership summer months. But the pure, or without the approved revenue and expense adjustments, the regional system-generated recovery ratio would be 43%. But again, that's an improvement over last month's result. So now, focusing on the certification of year-to-date financial results for the second quarter, this slide displays the variance of each service board's operating deficit from budget. The operating deficit is calculated by subtracting operating expenses from operating revenue, but does not consider the public funding results. So CTA's operating deficit was 0.7% unfavorable to budget due to the lower accrual, again, of the RFR, which each of the service boards had favorable variance. The other ones. The combined regional operating deficit was $15.9 million, or 2.2% favorable. So accordingly, we recommend that the results of the operation of each of the service boards and the region taken as a whole be found in substantial accordance with the adopted budget through the second quarter of 2015. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the region's performance measures for 2015 compared to 2014. So if we could bring that up, yeah. The first chart shows year-to-date regional ridership in comparison to the peer metropolitan areas that we use in our annual peer review. So as you can see, our ridership compares quite favorably. RTA system ridership was down 0.4% versus the first half of 2014, as indicated by that little orange bar. The performance was second only to Atlanta, which showed a 2.8% growth. And again, this is due to the rebound of their relatively low ridership in 2014 when they had those major winter storms, which paralyzed their transit system and just shuts them down. All 8 of our remaining peer regions had lower ridership in the first half, led by Boston, which of course, had historic snowfall this past winter. So even though we've been showing you decreased ridership news, the fact is that the RTA region has lost far less ridership this year than most of our peers. And this is despite the fare increase at Metro. So let's look at the next chart, which shows ridership changes by mode. At the service board and mode level, we see some encouraging signs in the first half of ridership. CTA bus ridership seems to have stabilized after declining in 2014. CTA rail ridership is up slightly, and the Metro ridership decrease of 0.8% is what they really expected based on their fare increase. Pace fixed route and Vanpool ridership was down by 6% and 2.3% respectively for the first half of 2015. Pace had provided some additional background on their fixed route ridership. Route pruning and consolidating has in places eliminated the need for Pace customers to transfer buses. So where this has occurred, what used to be counted as 2 rides or 2 short passenger rides is now counting as 1 longer passenger trip. So this may cause some of the reported ridership decrease. even though the same customer itinerary is being completed. PACE has also stated that you've heard this before, that the discontinuation of their cash transfers last summer has impacted their ridership and their cash-paying customers because it effectively raised fares since they're paying the full fare for the second leg of their trip. The final performance measure slide shows regional financial performance results. On this slide, the arrow indicates the trend in the measure compared to last year, with improvement shown by green arrows. Horizontal or orange arrows indicated just a negligible change of 1% in the measure, of less than 1% in the measure. Service levels, as measured by vehicle revenue hours and vehicle revenue miles, increased by 2.4% and 1% respectively. And that's driven mainly by the service expansion at CTA, as well as the demand for ADA paratransit service. Operating costs are shown per vehicle hour and per passenger trip and have been adjusted for inflation. These cost measures were higher than prior year, particularly the cost per passenger trip at 4%, as ridership was down 0.4%, while expenses increased. However, it is again important to stress that some cost increases were expected and budgeted. As you saw earlier, all of the service boards are operating within their budgeted expense amounts during the same period. The next two measures look at fare revenue, first on a per passenger trip basis and then related to costs by the fare recovery ratio. Fare revenue per passenger trip, or average fare, improved by 4 cents to $1.51, with Metro's fare increase in effect for the most of the first half of 2015. The system fare recovery ratio, which reflects only fare revenue and excludes other system revenues such as advertising and leases, was 0.3 percentage points lower at 36.8%, as cost increases outpaced fare revenue improvements. In summary, we can say again that while service levels are up, costs have increased but are within budgeted levels, and fare revenue performance is okay despite lower ridership. So we can, there's a lot more detail in their quarterly financial report that's been distributed. That concludes my remarks. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Yeah, I think this is a very nice comparison that you've given us as far as the performance measures. It really helps to be able to analyze what we're looking at. Director Totten?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you go back to the slide with us showing all the piers?
Okay.
That one there. Is that of concern when you look at almost every transit agency has had a reduction in ridership despite all the money we're trying to pour in to get people to ride on transit? I mean, ours, Chicago's a little less than everybody else. Does that trend, if you added 2013 on there, what would it look like? Do you know?
We don't have it here. We could certainly provide that because we do have that data. But I think, we've talked about how bus ridership nationally, this is regional ridership. This is all modes. So bus ridership is down nationally. We've talked about that before. Further, gas prices were lower for the same period. So the combination of the two, I think they're trends. I don't know that it's a permanent situation, but it is a trend. And bus ridership has been down nationally for most of this year and a little bit of last year, if we recall. That's what I would say, and maybe the gas prices as well, and those are going back up.
Well, that's why I say it would be good if you could add another year into it, so some of those, like
we can do
it
that.
didn't snow in Miami, but it did snow in Boston, and you can attribute so much to weather, and you can attribute so much to gas prices. But if you go back a little bit, it's helpful to kind of smooth out some of these differences.
We can provide that information for the years that we have.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, Director Lewis.
B, we talked about this before. In terms of expenses, I think fuel prices are a relatively small portion of the total expenses that are incurred by the service agencies. Is that not correct?
I'd have to look at the exact percentage, but I don't think that's true.
Oh, that's not true?
I think we'd have to look at exactly what it is depending on the agency, but it's a significant expense.
Okay. Because what I was going to say, I thought that it was, when we looked at it before, it wasn't There's larger components. So I was wondering if you took out fuel, how did the expenses change in those service agencies ex fuel? But the fuel is a larger portion of it than that question's not.
Let me get back to you on that to see what exactly the percentage is, but it's not as, depending on the service board, it varies, of course.
Okay.
And we'll look at that by service board, and then let's see what it looks like in terms of expense reduction without the fuel in it.
Thank you.
Director Hobson?
Yeah, I had a quick question about the final slide in terms of year-to-date performance measures. You show the operating cost per passenger trip increasing by 4%, yet the fare revenue per passenger trip increasing by 2.6%. So when your costs are, increasing faster than your revenue is increasing, that's a problem for the future, particularly for fare box recovery ratio maintenance. Is this? I recognize this is just one snapshot in time. What's the trend look like over 6 months, a year?
Well, we will have new actual comparison figures soon. Remember, we do that annual report on the full performance measures, so we'll see what those look like on an annual basis based on the NTD data. But this actually, other than the recent fare increases, that Metro offered, we've actually fared very well compared to our peers on this, being in the lower third, if I recall correctly. So let's look at that for you, and we'll provide more information. But I think in the next few months, we're actually going to have the new updated performance measures.
Yeah, I'm not concerned on our peer basis. I'm concerned for our own fare box recovery. If you have your expenses increasing faster than your revenue increases, the gap gets wider and wider over a period of time. So I was I'm obviously concerned about this and wondering what the trend has been for just the RTA system, what the trend has been in terms of costs versus revenues.
Okay, we can get that for you.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. Any other questions or comments? If not, this is a supermajority vote. Would the secretary call the roll?
Can we get a motion in a second?
Oh, how about a motion and a second?
That sounds like a great idea.
Maybe we don't have that. Motion by Director Colson,
Second.
second by Director Lewis. Roll call.
Director Buchanan? Director Colson?
Aye.
Director DeWitt?
Yes.
Director Lewis?
Aye.
Director Troiani?
Aye.
Director McGallis?
Aye.
6 ayes and 1 absent. And for the record, I voted for the minutes. There were 6 ayes and 1 absent, not 7.
Thank you. The third item on the agenda is the ordinance establishing the estimates of amounts available to the service boards for their 2016 through 2018 operating budget, the required recovery ratios for the 2016 and the preliminary 2016 through 2020 capital program funds. B.
Actually, before B jumps in and gives a more detailed presentation on the marks and the ordinance, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to sort of give some context to where we're at today and really state that, I guess initially, this is sort of unprecedented territory in RTA history, as we have never actually ever reached an agreement and a consensus on funding allocations by our August board meeting this early in the stage in the game each year. So that's a testimony and really a pat on the back to the staffs both at the RTA and at the service boards for the lot of hard work that they have been doing over the last couple of months. We do have a statutory obligation of completing this process by September 15th. Negotiating these marks typically occurs at our September board meeting, but as some of you who've been around a little while have also noted that has sometimes extended even beyond that statutory obligation. But so this is good because it gives us the service boards extra time in sort of planning and working through the development of their budgets. And as I mentioned, it's really a testimony to the great work Bea and her team with the service boards and the CFOs specifically have really come and rallied around this and done a lot of work to get us to this point today. But I think it's especially important that we have reached this consensus and the collaboration that we've sort of demonstrated during this uncertain state budget time in Springfield. We acknowledge that there are certainly no state funding guarantees, and this is certainly uncharted territory for us to be setting these allocations without a statewide budget in place. Nonetheless, it is critical that we move forward with our budgeting process. At this point, the only transportation appropriations bill to have passed the General Assembly kept our funding levels stable at fiscal year 2015 levels. We have stated time and time again that the funding we receive from the state is essential to the operations of our system. And we've also been very candid about saying that we could not absorb significant or any real cuts to our budgets without having to consider more drastic measures such as potential fare increases or service cuts. However, despite the ongoing budget impasse occurring in Springfield, we're obligated to move forward with our budgeting process. These funding allocations assume PTF funding at our current statutory levels. And while there has certainly been discussion of potential budget cuts to transit, we think the most responsible course for us to take at this juncture is to not conjecture as to what cuts we may sustain with respect to the state budget that does not even exist yet, but rather to assume that the state will continue to invest in our system at the level it has in the past, knowing that the services we provide are relied upon by so many and really drive our region's economy. While we know that we may have to make changes to this structure and the documents that we're asking you to approve today, if in the future the budget is actually cut in any significant way, we hope that the state will continue to see the importance of investing with us, much like the General Assembly recognized this earlier this year when they did pass that bill. And to that end, to continue to serve the taxpayers and the riders of our region in the most responsible way that we can. I'm going to ask Bea and potentially Bill Lackman to run through some of the details in the budget marks allocation for your consideration today. Thanks.
Thank you, Leanne. Bea.
So yes, we're very pleased that we have consensus and we have funding allocations. It's so important because then the service boards have the adequate time to go through their budget development and their public input period. I mean, in the past, there's been a bit of a scramble because there's less time for them to do that. But this is a really tough negotiation process. Everyone gives and takes. I want to really thank Tom Farmer, Ron Denard, Terry Brannon, my CFO peers, and because this is a lot of negotiation, it's a lot of give and take. PACE was able to do some adjustments in their budget. Everybody actually did. So the other thing that I'm very happy to report is that we have Bill Lackman, who has a long background in finance, both in budget and in the sales tax and public funding. As you know, he conducted Sales Tax 101 or something some months ago. So he was able to hit the ground running. And Doug as well, very instrumental in making all of this happen. With no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bill, who will take you through the details of the funding allocations. And again, we realize that we may need to come back to you and make some adjustments depending on, again, what happens with the state. Thank you, Bill.
Good morning, Chairman McGallis, members of the Finance Committee, Chairman Dillard, other members of the RTA Board. As Bea mentioned, this item addresses the proposed operating and capital funding amounts for the 2016 budget and 5-year capital program. Setting the funding amounts is a critical step in the RTA region's annual budgeting and public hearing process. The service boards are required by the RTA Act to use these amounts set by the RTA Board in the development of their budgets. The RTA Act establishes September 15th as the date by which the funding amounts must be set. In setting the funding amounts, the first step is establishing an RTA sales tax forecast. Sales tax growth has been relatively strong and stable for the last 5 years. The Chicago real estate transfer tax growth has been even stronger over these years. However, it is expected to fall in 2016 due to the number of one-time large commercial property sales in 2015. Our region is still lagging the nation in the economic recovery, but we are continuing to improve. The Chicago unemployment rate for June was 6.2%, higher than the national rate of 5.3%, but significantly lower than last year's Chicago rate of 7%. Our forecast for sales tax is based on a review of regional and national economic performance, including custom forecasts of the RTA sales tax provided by both the Chicago Federal Reserve and Moody's Analytics. These forecasts These forecasts suggest continued growth through 2018. However, the City of Chicago forecasts that the RET will decline 6.8% in 2016, following an 8% increase in 2015. This table shows the funding amounts proposed for each service board from the RTA Regional Sales Tax, State PTF, and the City of Chicago Real Estate Transfer Tax, and compares the proposed 26 funding allocations to the 2015 budgeted levels. Total funding of $1.5 billion represents growth of 3.5% over the 2015 budget and assumes PTF funding at current statutory levels. In addition to statutory funding prescribed by the RTA Act, each of the service boards receives some non-statutory funding. As you can see, CTA's growth rate of 4.4% in 2016 results in an increase of $33 million to nearly $790 million of funding. This despite the decline in RET, which funds only the CTA. Of the $790 million, $218 million is non-statutory funding. Metra's growth rate of 3.1% results in an increase of $12 million over the 2015 budget to a total of $397 million, including $1.4 million of non-statutory funding. The growth rate for PACE Suburban Service of 2.7% results in an increase of $4.3 million to $164 million for the year, including $4.9 million of non-statutory funding. PACE has also indicated that an RTA funding level of $160 million should be sufficient for 2016 ADA paratransit operations. This low funding growth rate of only 1.1% is made possible by lower per-trip costs resulting from the contracts that PACE has negotiated with its ADA paratransit operators. This chart shows the percentage of total operating funds to be received by each service board. CTA, 52.3%, Metra, 26%, PACE, 10.9%, and PACE ADA paratransit, 10.6%. These shares are very similar to the way the pie was sliced in 2015. The proposed recovery ratios for each agency remain unchanged from 2015. 54.5% for CTA, 52% for Metra, 30% for PACE Suburban Service, and 10% for PACE ADA paratransit. Switching over to the 2016 capital program. The 2016 capital program includes funding of $643 million. In contrast, the 2015 capital program, adopted by this board in December of 2014, totaled $1.3 billion, twice the 2016 figure. Keep in mind that the 2015 capital program included a $557 million TIFIA loan to the CTA. The lack of a state capital program, both this year and last year, is the primary reason why we are experiencing a capital funding shortfall. Without any new source of state funding, 2016 federal formula funds make up the overwhelming share of the 2016 capital program at 72%. CTA bond proceeds, on the other hand, are the next largest contributor at 23%. Federal formula funds, the federal formula amounts predicted on the federal formula amounts is predicated on the funding levels consistent with the current MAP 21 authorization. This pie chart shows the capital funding from all sources split amongst the service boards. CTA will receive $422 million, or 65.6%. Metra, $180 million, or 28%. Pace Suburban Service, $41.2 million, or 6.4%. Keep in mind that the split of federal formula funds among the service boards is 58% to CTA, 34% to Metra, and 8% to Pace Suburban Service. Also, unlike operating funds, the capital funding amounts remain preliminary until the budget is adopted. These amounts can be updated if additional capital funding sources become available. Here is a snapshot of the business plan calendar through the remainder of this year. The RTA board adopted the business plan call at the May meeting, setting up the budget development process. Today, we are recommending board adoption of the funding allocations as I've presented them here. On September 30th, just 6 weeks from now, the service boards submit their operating budgets, 2-year financial plans, and 5-year capital programs to the RTA before entering the public hearing process in October and November. November 15th is the statutorily defined date for the service boards to submit their adopted budgets to the RTA. On December 3rd, a special meeting of the Finance Committee will be held to review the business plans of each service board. Then, on December 17th, RTA staff will present a consolidated regional budget for board adoption. The RTA and the service boards have worked collaboratively through several rounds of negotiations to reach consensus on these funding levels. These funding levels address the needs of the region and the service boards in a fair and equitable manner. And we are coming before you almost 1 month prior to the statutorily defined deadline. As such, staff is requesting that the Finance Committee recommend board adoption of the funding amounts as presented for the first time in RTA history in the month of August. This concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to address any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. Obviously, your team and Land have done a great job working with the service boards to move us this fast into the process. One comment about the document, I guess, goes back to what Director Hobson talked about, recovery ratios. If you noticed in the document as presented, looking at the revenues, it's exactly 50%, absolute minimum as presented. So you do run into a situation where eventually you won't be at 50% or plus. So it's something we do keep an eye on all the time. Director Totten.
Director McGillis, to that point, we were actually looking at increasing them, but we listened to the service boards, given the uncertainty of the reduced fare reimbursement, which is what, is legitimately programmed into calculating the recovery ratio. We just felt it wasn't prudent to increase them this year. Although we have been increasing them in prior years, like 1% or, 0.5%. From 2013, we increased them to 2014, but we've just felt this year it was just not prudent to do so given what we didn't know what was going to happen with the RFR.
Sure. Director Totten.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the public hearings and county board presentations, that's mandated by the Act, is that correct? My observation is I've attended a few of these, and outside of staff and maybe one director, nobody else comes to them, or very few. My observation from a number of years of attending some of these is, why do we do it if nobody's coming to the party? I would suggest that if you review transcripts of some of these, you'll find very few questions raised by the public, and outside of the pontificating by who's ever giving the presentation, that's about it. And this is one of those mandates that probably should be reviewed because again, there is considerable staff time and so on being used to prepare for these meetings and expenses to attend the meetings. Thank you.
One of the things that we started some years back that has helped, I think, it used to be that the RTA would hold theirs, PACE would hold theirs, Metra. So we tried the process of consolidating those hearings, and that really helped in Lake County. I mean, we have PACE at the meeting and Metra, but it goes back and forth. Sometimes the schedules don't work out. If you want to make something mandatory, have all the hearings at one time so you can get all the information at one time. And I think it's better that way. We also meet with our other directors from Metro and PACE at those hearings. And that has worked really well, and probably if we don't need a state law on that, we ought to really encourage that be done.
We plan to continue to do that this year. And last year, the last few years, actually, we've really more specifically partnered with Metra because they cover the exact same area that we cover as well. We do have an additional hearing that the RTA does at the end of the whole process here downtown as well. But that has reduced some of our costs. We're not having two sets of court reporters going out. Staff are there for one meeting. We hear, and to your point about no one comes to the party, well, it's not a very exciting party. So the only time that people really come to these hearings, even for the service boards, is when there's the potential of fare increases or service cuts, when there's some real issue on the table. And in partnering with Metro last year, I think the value that we provide, because we're sort of the umbrella of the overarching regional budget, and then most people are actually there to hear about the specifics of a service board. And so it puts what we're talking about in context of a service board, and it starts to actually make a little more sense to the public as well. So we continue to plan to do that this year.
I agree with Leanne. We've had, when Metro had their 20% increase or 25% fare increase, we had people show up at the hearings to specifically address that. And I was really glad they did, because out of the ones, if you go back and look at the testimony, they all supported the need for the fare increase. And these were everyday riders who valued the Metro service, who said this needed to be done. You haven't raised your fares. They felt that one thing that they did recommend was spread those increases out. Don't hit me all at once with 25%. So we got some good input, even though there was maybe only 3 or 4 people there. We've experienced the same thing in Lake County with ADA. We have a lot of attendance. I don't think I've ever had a meeting that there wasn't an ADA rep either there or had given us input. Which is good. I mean, it's an opportunity. Consolidating saved us money. The need to try to get the public there. I don't know. I looked at, are we marketing? And we have all kinds of marketing campaigns to try to get people to ride and so forth. Making information available, having those meetings at a convenient location, trying to get people to show up, I think is key. It's tough to get that time of theirs, but the more convenient we make it, more likely you might get somebody to attend. Director Lewis.
Let me start out by saying to Leanne and Bee and the team, I think it is a great thing that we've got the budget this early and the level of cooperation between the service agencies. I think it's commendable. So let me start out by saying that's terrific. My question is really just one that kind of piggybacked on the capital expenditure budget and the allocation that was outside of formula. I assume that was because in the negotiation there was a higher need, higher prioritization, say, for example, in terms of one budget, say CTA versus the Metro versus PACE being allocated differently, and that was the basis for deviating from the statutorily allocated formula.
Director Lewis, actually, the reason CTA's share looks a lot larger is that they are very actively seeking federal loans like TIFIA, and further, they've done the most extensive bonding. The regular federal capital dollars are allocated by formula, that 59, 38, and so forth. So that's by formula. Any of those extra dollars are dollars that CTA has sought on their own through bonding and through federal type of loans like TIFIA. So that's really what's driving that. But the reality is that through our project, capital project vetting and our capital optimization support tool that you've seen, all of those projects, for the most part, all we're investing in is state of good repair kind of things, because there isn't the money for expansion or enhancements or things like that. So when you look at need-based assignment, it's all need-based, because there isn't, if it was unrestricted funding, you could address some of the other things, and that's when you'd get into, okay, but it's all need-based because that's where they all fall in at this point. Thank you.
Thank you.
The one last comment I have, the caution that Leanne mentioned, that this is based on the assumption that we get the same amount of support from the state that we got last year. Right off the bat, we know that the subsidy to the ride free or half fare now, who knows what we're going to get. But down the road, if we don't get those, then I think we ought to recommend that we eliminate that service that was created by the former governor, not the most recent one, but before that, Rod. That we get out of that, because if they can't afford to reimburse us for their good idea, we can't afford to fund it out of the money we don't have. And it's really, estimates are all over the place, 30 million, 40 million. But bottom line, it is a cost that has been passed on to us that we just need to rethink if that's what it comes down to.
That service is audited, and it's over $100 million is what the service boards collectively advertise it's costing the region.
Okay. So, it is big money. Yes, Director Buchanan.
Yeah, I just have one question. With what the state owes the RTA today, are we safe to assume that 2017-18, are we going out too far, too quick, or has that all been taken into consideration?
If you're looking at a state delinquency, Leanne will report on that as part of the ED report. They're about consistent. It's interesting because some monies we've actually gotten sooner than we expected, like the debt service reimbursement monies, but on the public transportation fund match, that's, I think, 1 month later. So Leanne will report on that. In terms of the out years, 2017 and 2018, we've assumed the same consistent level of funding. We're required to do a 2-year business plan, but we know we may have to amend the budget for 2016. So 2017 and 2018 are proposals at this point, and we'll see where we end up with public funding.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Mr. Chairman.
ADA, the PACE paratransit stuff. So is that going to overtake sometime the cost of the actual PACE regular suburban bus system? When will those lines cross?
It is neck and neck today.
As B highlighted too, their growth is somewhat stabilizing, and then their cost increases, they were able to successfully they rebid contracts and actually realized some pretty significant cost savings, which is sort of keeping those expenses in check. But yes, it's a large portion of services that PACE provide out across, because it's the entire region. Remember, it's not just in the suburban location.
And that's a cut that the state's looking at as well. And that one just sticks out. That service, as we age as a population, we just had the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's going to be a growing population. And I always remind people, when I talk about PACE, that one of the hidden services that people, even I, when I became the chairman of this board, didn't understand the importance of what PACE does day in and day out to keep individuals in touch with their physicians, their families. That is a life-saving, changing service that keeps people in their homes and allows them to have a quality of life that they wouldn't have without it. And as you see those numbers, it's just an incredibly important service that most people don't understand we provide. And PACE does such a good job at it that the CTA has asked them to take that service over. So that's just one, we need to, I think, continue to advocate, because those numbers are just, they're staggering in terms of the growth. It's good that they got that savings, though.
And as you know, it's a federal law that we provide this service for our region. So regardless of what Springfield does, we are federally required, and it's a civil rights issue and responsibility that we provide those services.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, Director DeWitt.
You brought up the issue about free ride and discounted rides. Does this board have the authority to eliminate that program? Were those not legislatively approved programs?
That is correct. It would take an act of the legislature.
It's just like what we just talked about with the ADA. That's a federal mandate. we have to deal with it, we have to fund it, and we've done a good job at funding it and keeping it running. I think it's a great program. It is one of the fastest projected growth items that we have in our budget. Like you were talking about, when will that grid cross where we have more ADA costs? But bottom line, we have to do it, so we have to make cuts. If the state decides they're not going to fund it, we have to make cuts other areas to continue funding that. Just like when you go back to the other options that we have with ride half fare, we can't cut it, we can't eliminate it. It's a state mandate. The state would have to deal with it. It's a fairly new one that should be looked at if indeed we have those kind of financial problems.
Some of the reduced fare rides are federally required, but the free fares were state legislation.
It's means tested. So, but anyway, there's a lot of people riding that would not meet the means test. Other questions or comments? If not, do we have a motion? Motion by Director Durrani, second by Director DeWitt. By Director DeWitt. Roll call.
Director Buchanan?
Aye.
Director Colson?
Yes.
Director DeWitt?
Yes.
Director Lewis?
Aye.
Director Troyani?
Aye.
Director McGallis?
Aye.
6 ayes and 1 absent.
Thank you. Any other items anybody has for the committee today? If not, we have a motion to adjourn. Motion by Director DeWitt, second by Director Buchanan. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Nays? Ayes have it. Thank you. Committee is adjourned.